Hi, everyone, and welcome to this exciting webinar that we have for you today. Thank you for tuning in. It's really a pleasure to host this series of webinar. Usually, every 2 to 3 weeks, we invite a fantastic guest to talk about a data topic or something in general related to the field of tech. Today, we have a great guest for you, but before we go, and just to wait a little couple seconds before everyone has the time to tune in, maybe very briefly can go into what and who is data scientist. In case you're not familiar with our work, we are a next generation training institution specializing in all things tech, but especially data and AI. So if you're ever curious about our courses to become a data analyst, a machine learning engineer, an analytics engineer, a data engineer, so on and so forth, please feel free to check out our website, where you'll always be able to book an appointment with a counselor to ask any and all questions regarding our remote but very engaging tech courses. In any case, today we have a great guest, Jan Nitschke, who is a managing partner at 11 Owls, a consulting firm in data and analytics. Without any further ado, I'd love to introduce Jan to you all and leave the floor over to him.
Hello. Thank you very much. I'm still missing my slides. There we go. Cool. Well, thank you very much for that brief introduction. So my name is Jan, and together with my friend Lucille, I founded 11 Owls some 3 years ago. And before I jump into the topic, I want to give you a brief introduction into what we actually do. We are a strategic consultancy, and we also do technical implementation in two different fields. The first one is, and you'll probably be very familiar with that one, is the field of data analytics. So we help companies derive and realize data strategies. We help them conceptualize and implement data warehouse solutions, and we build data models on top of that, and then enable companies to build reporting capabilities. And then we help internalize what we've built by helping them build data teams or building them the organizational structures that they need to work with what we have built. And then the second pillar of our work takes a more holistic approach at this whole problem, and we are looking more at a data architecture level. So we understand how a business process is reflected in the individual systems and tools that you have in your organization. And we help you streamline these data flows or integrate new tools into your existing data flows. And the talk I want to give today mainly explains why we think that these two go very well together, and why we think that you all as data analysts have a very high stake in what we call enterprise data architecture. So let me jump right in with something that probably most of you are very familiar with. So we as data professionals, we often might feel like firefighters, right? We often are confronted with situations where we need to act quickly. A dashboard shows a wrong number, something in your source system is not right. There's a whole bunch of fires that we constantly have to put out. And over the years, we have equipped ourselves with a whole range of tools to protect us from these fires. I like to think of these tools in three categories. We have tech in the first category. So that's all the data warehouses that we have, the data pipelining tools like Airflow, for example, or the data modeling tools that we have like dbt to define a data model. So all the tools that power the data platforms that we build. Second, we have a range of governance tools that allow us to very strictly control how we publish the data, to test our data. So we have things like Great Expectations, which help us to define very concrete tests on the data. Or we have something, and that has been talked a lot about throughout this year, the metrics layer. So things like Cube, dbt has its own metrics layer as well. Tools that allow us to very specifically control how we publish information. And then lastly, we have communication tools. So essentially the wide range of dashboard tools that we have to communicate the insights that we generate. So when we think back of firefighters, what they do in bushfires or in forest fires is they build trenches throughout the bushlands here in this case, right? So you have the fire on the left-hand side of the bushlands, and the fire won't be able to jump over this fire trench. So at least the right side of the bushlands remains intact, right? So even though we have a big fire, we can at least save some of the bushlands. And I want to argue today that in data, we're doing something very similar, right? All these tools that we have given ourselves, they form this fire trench so that we can protect ourselves from these fires that are burning throughout our organization, yet still deliver the reports and the insights that are expected from us. But that is a very frustrating situation sometimes, right? Because we're really only protecting ourselves from the fire, but we're not doing anything about the fire itself, right? So we at 11 Owls, we put a lot of thought about how can we be more proactive about these fires, coming from the data analyst perspective that we are in. And to do so, I want to introduce you to a model that has helped us a lot to think about this problem. And we want to understand how the process of making an analysis works. So let's picture an analysis where we want to understand how our marketing team performs. So in most cases, it starts off with some business process that you want to analyze, right? So in our case, we have a marketing team that runs a campaign on a number of ad platforms, and the goal of these campaigns is to generate new purchases in our shop. So you implement that process in a set of operational tools that will create some data for us, right? So we have the ad platforms, and we might have a website or a shop that generates tracking information. We then pull that information out of these operational tools into a single repository, a data warehouse, a data lake, or maybe directly into API tool, and we then build a data model on top of this, right? So we as analysts, we think about the question, well, now that I have these two different data sources, the ad platform and the shop, how can I bring these two together to answer the question, well, which purchases do I attribute to which marketing campaign, right? Essentially, the business logic of matching shops and campaigns happens in the data model step. And then last but not least, we'll create a report and a KPI that will provide the insights that we wanted to provide. So we'll say, well, this campaign can be attributed to, say, 10 purchases that we see in our shop. Cool. So this is the model that I want to use to think about this question a little more. Now, in more concrete terms, what does it look from a tooling perspective? So we start off with a business process. We have our marketing manager who runs the campaign, who creates the campaign. So that's where things start. We then have maybe a Shopify-based shop, and we might run the ads on TikTok and Instagram maybe. We then pull the data into our own infrastructure or data infrastructure. So that might be a Snowflake-based data warehouse, and then we have dbt on top to build a data model. And then finally, we'll build a report in the dashboard tool that our company uses. Now, what I think is important here to note is that we as data analysts, we need to understand all four of these layers in order to be able to perform our analysis. We have to have a good line of communication to the marketing manager to understand what was the intention of your campaign. We need to understand how Shopify works and how Instagram data and TikTok data looks like, right? So that we can then bring them together. So we need to work across all four of these layers. But what's funny, if we think about which of these layers we actually have an influence on, this becomes, or we have drawn a very distinct line between step 2 and step 3, right? We assume that all these tools that we pull data from, given they're not operated by us, right? The Shopify and the Instagram and the TikTok, we don't have any influence on them. So we just pull their data, we just take it as it is, and then we continue moving forward in our systems, right? Once the data is in our systems there, we have full control and we can manipulate and fix the data as we want, right? But we don't touch the tools that the data is coming from. We're mere consumers of that information. Now, the problem that we see is if we look at the projects that we do, very often the fire is burning in the operational system and the source data, right? So the problem that we have to deal with originates from systems that we have very little control over, and that can be very frustrating. So let's think back of our example that we looked at, right? So in our case, we would have a marketing manager who still builds a campaign, and that campaign is then reflected in Shopify, Instagram, and TikTok. Now, the issue here is, or the start of our problem is, the campaigns are not properly passed to our Shopify shop system. So whenever somebody clicks a campaign or the ad on Instagram, that information is not properly passed to Shopify. So in my Shopify system, I might get a track event that is not associated to the ad platform that is coming from. So how does that progress throughout this model? We'll build a data model, but we cannot connect the track event to the actual ad. And eventually we will publish a report that will underrepresent or under-attribute the relevance of that specific ad, right? So what do we need to do to solve this more sustainably? We need to start thinking about step 2, right? We need to start thinking about what can we do to support people to build better operational systems so that we can fix the fire where it actually started. How do we do that? Now, I want to argue that you as data analysts, your task should not be to fix the issue, right? You're not the owner of the tool, so it shouldn't be your job to fix the issue. But what you can do, and maybe what you need to do, is you need to create awareness of this issue. And I want to present you with 3 arguments why I think that we as data analysts have a very unique perspective on this issue, why we are the ones that should create awareness, or why we are in a position of creating awareness for this issue. So what can we do? The first one is you can create urgency, right? You can create urgency for the issue by saying no. So try not to solve every data issue that you have in your tool stack, right? As long as nobody sees the fire in your organization, nobody will understand why you are calling the fire brigade, so to say, right? So it's important to make the fire visible. As long as you'll cover up the issues that are coming from the source systems, why should anybody worry about it? You're solving their issue in your systems. The second thing that you can do is you can create transparency for the issues, right? I'm sure many of you will know situations or will have stories to tell about source data being messy, about inconsistencies that you've uncovered. And I think it's a good first step, or it's a very good first step to just share that knowledge with the people that actually own these systems, right? If we think back of the case of the Shopify and the ads, go back to the person who actually implemented the ads and let them know, hey, I think there's an issue with passing the ID to Shopify. And then last but not least, offer your help when there is change in the source systems, right? So whenever maybe a new tool gets introduced into the tool landscape of your organization, or when a tool undergoes a major refactoring, urge that person who is responsible of that project to include your perspective into the process of implementing that new tool, right? Don't wait for the tool to be implemented to be then faced with the shortcomings of the tool. Something you can also do in a more proactive way would be to inspect the data early in the process. So do request access to the data that these systems will produce, and then compare that to the other information that you might have from other source systems. So these are 3 things that you can do to raise awareness for this issue and to make that issue more visible in your organization in an hope to get those that actually own the tools to fix these topics. Now, why do I think that you as an analyst should do that? Why should that be your issue? Why shouldn't that be someone else's problem? Now, we argue that we as data analysts, we have a very unique perspective on this issue that in many cases we see is not present anywhere else in an organization. And we think so because of three reasons that I will go through in detail throughout my next slides. The first one is we understand the difference between operational requirements to data and analytical requirements to data. The second reason is we understand how data flows across different systems. And then the third reason is we have a single data repository that allows us to combine information and to quickly analyze information from different source systems. So let's jump into each of these three perspectives in more detail. Let's start with the operational versus analytical data requirement. Now, what do I mean by that exactly? I think to data, there's always two types of requirements, right? There is an operational requirement that this data needs to fulfill. So in most cases, the data needs to provide some kind of information about how something is, right? I want to know what permissions, for example, a user has in my application. That's the operational requirement that this data set that this tool holds need to fulfill. From an analytical point of view, that can be very different, right? I might be interested in how a certain property has evolved over time, right? Yet the same data needs to be able to answer both of these questions. Now, I brought a little case study or use case to explain that in more detail. Let's picture a customer relationship management system like Salesforce, right? So you have an organization that has some salespeople, and these salespeople operate in Salesforce. That's their tool that they do their job with. And now these salespeople, they do a couple of sales activities. They write emails, they do phone calls, they might meet with people. And in Salesforce, they have like a table or a view that allows them to log these activities, right? And they log these activities as free text, right? They just type, well, today I had a call with Marie, or I had a meeting with Peter, right? They'll just write that down. Now you have two requirements to this data. The first one is you have an operational requirement, and that might be you want to provide the sales agent with an overview over the sales activity that person has done with a particular potential client, right? So as a sales agent, I want to go into my client. I want to be able to scroll through the activities that I've performed with this client. Now, the free text solution might work just fine here, right? Because it's probably going to be 4 or 5, 6 touch points I had with this client. You can just read through them. Operational requirement is met. Now, from an analytical point of view, I might have a very different requirement to that data. I might want to be interested in understanding, well, how many calls did a particular sales agent do last week? Or how many emails did a particular department do in the last week? So for that requirement, having the data as free text might be more problematic, right? Because it's probably harder to aggregate all the events that are calls and distinguish them from those that are meetings. So we here have an architectural gap between the operational requirement and the analytical requirement. And we argue that we as data analysts, our unique perspective on this architectural problem is that we can translate the analytical requirement, so in our case, being able to analyze a certain type of activity across time or across a range of sales agents, and we can translate these requirements into concrete data requirements. We can go to the tool owner and tell the tool owner, hey, your data needs to be able to answer this question for me. So this is the first perspective that we think is unique to data analysts. What is the second perspective? Cross-system data flows. What do we mean by that? We, data analysts, when we perform an analysis, we need to combine information from different systems, right? So we have a very good understanding how a particular piece of information is represented in different systems. Again, let's look at a concrete use case. Picture a task of creating a user journey. So you want to be able to understand how a user traverses through individual steps in your business, right? Let's keep this simple. Maybe you have a marketing team that sends out emails to potential clients. You have a sales team that will pick up the phone and call these people, and then you have your product or your product, which the user will then end up buying. And the user journey you want to be able to analyze, understand, well, out of those who bought the product, who received the email, right? Or how long ago did that person receive my initial email? So the requirement that we have here to the data is that we must be able to track that individual person throughout all of these three systems, right? That person remains the same, but maybe when we send the marketing email to begin with, that user doesn't have like a unique identifier in our system, right? So we need to make sure that we can track that user throughout all three of these systems. So the architectural gap here that we are solving is we can understand how does each of these systems represent a user, and how can we make sure that we are able to identify the same user across all of these three systems, right? So yeah, to summarize, we understand how these data flows work between systems. And then lastly, we have a single data repository. And that is super powerful because probably nowhere else in your organization do you have the technical capabilities to combine data from different sources with such ease as you might have in your single repository. Now, that might be a data warehouse or a data lake, or it depends on the technical platform that you're running. So what would be a concrete use case for this? Now, picture a situation where you have a subscription management system, so a system that is intended to manage the subscriptions that users have in your product, and you have an ERP system that is used by accounting to do accounting stuff. Now, both of these systems will have to deal with invoices, right? Maybe the subscription system creates the invoice and sends it to the client, but the invoice also needs to end up in your ERP system because the accounting will need the information from the invoice to do their bookkeeping. Now, what happens if once the invoice lands with or is sent to accounting, they realize, oh, we need to change something about the invoice. Maybe the address was wrong. So they go ahead and change that in their system, right? But that change is never synced back to the subscription management system. So what is the situation you end up with is you have two systems that have the same, or should contain the same information, yet they diverge from one another, right? And these inconsistencies can happen very quickly if you haven't properly synced up your data flows between your systems. Now, the architectural gap that we can overcome is with the single repository that we have, we can uncover these inconsistencies very quickly, right? Because it will boil down to running, if you have a data warehouse, to running a SQL query, right? And that way you can uncover these inconsistencies. Otherwise, you will probably have to do a manual export of your ERP system, a manual export of your subscription management system, and then you would have to bring these two together to uncover these inconsistencies. So we as analysts, we have tools and technologies to combine these information from different sources, and thereby we can make the fire visible very, very easily. So that's the last reason why we think that we as data analysts, we have a unique perspective on this problem of understanding what is wrong with how data flows between our operational systems. Now, I want to conclude with why this is important. Like, why is this something that you should care about as data analysts? And there are mainly three reasons. The first one is probably pretty obvious, right? You want to make your life easier. it can be very frustrating to have to fix data issues all the time, because you don't have time to focus on your actual work, right? Your work becomes very reactive and not proactive. So the less fire there is, the less you have to worry about putting them out all the time, right? It will also reduce the number of tools that you have to deal with, right? You won't have to put up such a high barrier to protect yourself from fire. The second one is you can extend your impact in your organization. Bad data architecture can be very harmful for your entire organization, not just from a data perspective, right? If the data flows in your organization are not synced up properly, then that can lead to very bad operational impacts as well. And then last but not least, use that unique perspective that you have in your organization. Leverage that position that you have, because we very much think that you have a perspective on this whole issue that probably not so many in your organizations have. So that is why it is so important for you as an analyst to contribute that perspective to the resolution of that problem. This concludes my short presentation. Thank you very much for listening. Feel free to scan this QR code to download the slides if you want, or to reach out. There's also my contact information on screen here. So I'm happy to take questions now, if I understood correctly. But of course, if you have any questions, maybe later, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn or via email.
Thank you so much, Jan, for a very insightful talk. Yes, please, anyone and everyone, feel free to ask your question in the chat, whether you're tuning in from LinkedIn or from YouTube. We can always see these questions. So if you have any comment, question, ideas, whatever, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll be sure to try at least to answer them. All right, this is kind of the typical question, Jan, while we wait for any questions that we may have, that we like to answer, that we like to ask most of our guests, right? Working in the field of analytics, what is, and I think you're seeing me coming from a mile away, what is your take on Gen AI and how that might help or not help your profession, maybe diffuse some of the knowledge, maybe also get people interested in these topics, the non-technical folk? It's just one of the typical questions we usually like to ask around. It's a lot of changes these past few months. What's your take on those topics in just a couple words, maybe?
Yeah, very interesting question. I'll have to be careful not to spend the remaining half an hour talking about this. But so what we've seen in our space is people got excited about Gen AI because they thought, oh, great, now I can start chatting with my data. I no longer have to write SQL queries. But essentially, we saw a host of tools popping up that would promise us that we can interact with our data warehouse in a more chat type fashion, right? I could ask like, okay, what if we stick with that ad problem? How many purchases did that ad produce, essentially, right? And then the LLM would kind of understand that question, write the SQL query for us, and return us the result. Now, the problem with this is this doesn't work. Why does this not work? Because we have so much context information, and we have so much details that we need to take care in our analysis, that it becomes very hard, if not impossible, to provide the LLM with that kind of information so that it can answer the question right. So for very simple questions, your LLM will probably do fine, but as soon as you get more complex and as soon as your business logics become complex, then that becomes an issue. So I think there's two solutions to that. The first one is we need to understand what information do we need to start collecting so that in the future, because I think this is the future that, we'll be able to talk to our data at some point. But today we need to understand what is the information that we need to gather now, so that at some point I will be able to throw that at an LLM so it can actually contextualize my business better, right? So that's question one. And then question two is, how do I need to simplify, and that brings me back to the topic of my talk, how do I need to simplify the architectural landscape that I have to make the life for an LLM easier, right? So I think that's the two ways that you can approach this issue.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't think we're at the point yet where non-technical folk can speak directly with these Gen AI, just because if you're not capable of understanding the SQL query that came out of it, you're going to have a hard time making sure that the data that came out is the one that you were actually looking
Yeah,
for.
exactly. So I think we are still not at a place where an LLM will produce a result that is so reliable and so good that we can share that without a person that actually understands the business context and is able to translate that into SQL, kind of checks and validates that query, right? And as long as we haven't really solved that problem, then I don't see any benefits from running an LLM. Maybe last comment on that. What we do see and things that actually do work is these systems work very well in very contained environments. So think, for example, about e-commerce shops, right? Especially in early stages, they all look very much the same from a data perspective, right? They have some performance marketing, they have a shop system, and then they might have some like an ERP system or something, but they're all like highly standardized. And in these scenarios, an LLM can be very powerful because essentially you have a standard data model that you can apply to the data of that shop. And in these cases, applying or putting like this chat interface on top of your data works rather well. But for the majority of cases, and especially if you're getting to larger organization, this will fail very quickly.
Definitely. And we have a very interesting question from Richard Makara. Jan, how do you approach getting buy-in for good data architecture? I found it to be a hard pitch since the feel people get is that doing things properly means slowing down and that the benefits are hypothetical. This is coming from someone who tried to sell a data modeling product that gives you great architecture.
Yeah, that's a good question, and obviously that's super important, especially if you want to get buy-in from management to these questions. So, I think the first thing that you need to understand is bad data architecture does not only lead to you no longer being capable of steering your organization right, because the more complex kind of your upper funnel gets, the more problems you'll have to actually distill insights that are anywhere near meaningful to steer your business process. But what is more important to make or to understand is that if you have bad data architecture, this can have very negative operational impact as well. And this is where people tend to start listening in, right? So two examples. The first one is, let's assume you have a company that has a whole range of legacy systems that restricts them a lot in how they can develop their own business, right? So if you have a situation where you are faced with a data architecture that is so complex that no one really in your organization understands how that works, it becomes very difficult to build the product that you want to build, right? Or to extend the product that you have. So that's something that people tend to listen to. And the second thing is there's huge inefficiencies in all of this, right? Because if we think back of the invoice example that I brought to you earlier, right, where you might have two systems that both contain information about invoices, yet they have different versions of that invoice. At some point, you will have an operational problem where this clashes, right? Think of a situation where if you have a subscription service, you want to issue a new invoice, right? So now, who do you issue this new invoice to? The corrected address in the ERP system or the old but wrong invoice address in your subscription management system? So the solution is, well, somebody will have to go in and manually fix that issue, right? Hugely inefficient. So these two verticals, I'd say, are what I think we must understand and we must put the point towards.
Thank you. Any other questions from the folks tuning in? We still have a few minutes, so Please feel free to ask any and all questions. All right, and maybe one last question from me. What is a tool you discovered in the past, I'll say, I'll limit it to 3 or 4 months, that you think is worth giving a shout for? It's always interesting to have a look out for some of the new technical elements that might be popping up. It can be a tool or a feature of an existing tool that you think is worth giving a shout because it's a nice feature that was designed by people that actually had data in mind or business data in mind.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, we are very proud and happy to not be bound to specific tools, right? That's something that we at 11 Hours hold very high because it allows us to a great deal of flexibility in how we implement our project. So I think in terms of data tooling, I wouldn't want to promote or like say this is going to be a tool that definitely solves the question, because it's very much dependent on the use case that you have. Now, Richard, the guy who posed the question, I think has an interesting idea that he is currently working on, and that might be something that's definitely worth sharing. Because what he does, he builds a notebook for data analysts, right? So Richard and his friend, they are currently building Reconfigured, and they are building a very low entry barrier for analysts to take notes about what they're doing. Now, why do I think this is important? Because what we've looked at today, when we think about data architectures, these are highly complex systems, right? The problem why we need to worry about them in the first place is because they have become so complex that nobody really understands how they work, or even how they interact with one another, right? We might have individual tool owners that might understand how an individual tool works, but as soon as we connect these tools into a larger network, as we do in data analytics, then we very quickly lose information. And I think a first step in solving that can be, let's try to aggregate as much information about these tools as we can, right? The nice thing about LLMs is they're very good at you throwing a whole bunch of information at them, and then they distill the relevant features for you. So if we can set a very low barrier for people that are interacting with these tools anyway, that being analysts, and have them input as much information about these tools as we can, I think that is a highly or a very valuable mission to also tackle this issue of data architecture.
And well, thanks for giving a shout to Richard's work. And I think Richard gave it back to you by asking another question, a follow-up question. If bad data architecture is already in place, how have you managed to start or greenlight a re-architecture project?
Yeah, good question. In most cases, we don't do full re-architecture because as we've discussed before, like fully re-architecturing an organization is a very costly, and B is a very, very large project to begin with, right? So what we see very often is when you introduce a new tool. So let's say, I don't know, you need to change your ERP system because maybe you've been using Navision, for example, and you're introducing SAP or something, or you are introducing a new tool for your sales team, for example. These are points in time where it makes perfect sense to just include the analytical perspective as well into this process of introducing the tool, because the decision to introduce the tool has been taken anyway, right? So finding these spots or these point in times, we feel is very crucial, or can be very, or that can be a very good point in time to start thinking about, okay, what do we need to change to our data infrastructure to make our lives easier?
All right. Well, then, but most people have already said thank you so much, Jan, and I can only join them in thanking you for taking some time out of your day to help us and give us some great insights here today. I don't think I see any more questions, so thank you so much, Jan. Thanks for accepting our invite. Good luck with 11 Owls, and maybe talk to you very soon.
Thank you very much for having me, and I hope everybody has a good rest of their day.
Cheers, everyone. Goodbye.
Ciao.